Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Roundtable event. We are so excited to be co-hosting this particular Roundtable event with Mid-American Regional Council. Today, we're going to be discussing stormwater runoff in Missouri, and I'll be co-moderating with Cynthia Isha. Cynthia Isha is a water quality planner with the Mid-American Regional Council. But before we begin, I just want to list out some of the housekeeping items. Please ensure your microphones are muted, and also if during the course of the discussion you have any questions, do not hesitate to type them in the chat box. I'll be on the lookout for it, and also my colleagues will be on the lookout for it. Before I go over to the panelists, I just want to give a brief overview of what Most Policy Initiative is about for those who are joining our roundtable event for the first time. So Most Policy Initiative is a non-partisan, non-profit organization. Our mission is to promote long-term health, sustainability, and economic growth for people in Missouri. And we do this by connecting science to policy on both state and the local level. It's also important to note that the Most Policy Initiative does not participate in policy advocacy. We aim to be an honest broker of quality information to inform evidence-based decision making. On the other hand, the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network is a program under the Most Policy Initiative organization, and it was co-established with the American Association of Advanced Science. The whole aim of the Missouri LCN2 is to bridge that gap between science and policy on both state and local level. So today you are all welcome to our roundtable discussion. As I earlier mentioned, today's discussion is titled Stormwater Runoff in Missouri. My name is Ngozi Ndeku, and I am the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network Coordinator. So I'm going to give it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. They're going to tell us about themselves and also tell us their work and their interests. Joel, you can go first.
Hi, I'm Joel Burken. I'm Department Chair and Curator's Distinguished Professor at Missouri University of Science and Technology here in Rollin, Missouri. And my interest in this area and activity has been mostly looking at green roofs. And we've tried to understand how climate can impact how much water, stormwater, can be dissipated through green infrastructure, and particularly green roofs, where the water is stored on the roof and then evapotranspired back to the environment instead of becoming stormwater runoff. And we've looked at, and with a typical design, we can attenuate 50 to 60% in Missouri, and we can augment that design through advanced amendments to the green roof media. So that's what we've been studying, and we're trying to link that to climate so we can project out for different climates in different places of the US, how much water we can dissipate that way. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Joel. Tom, you can introduce yourself too.
Thank you, Ngozi. I'm Tom Jacobs. I'm the Director of Environmental Programs at the Mid-America Regional Council in Kansas City. MARC, as we're known, is the Regional and Metropolitan Planning Organization for our bi-state metro area. And it's our job to help find collaborative solutions to problems that cross city and county and state lines. And so water quality and flooding and water resource management fits squarely in that box. We've been working on water resource management issues, stormwater management issues for a long time in Kansas City, and are trying to figure out how we can turn water into an asset, right, and manage stormwater in the face of climate change to be to make us more resilient as a community. And so there's a lot of discussions we have going on around that. It'll be fun to share a little bit more about that as the conversation goes along.
Thank you, Joe. I also want to mention that one of our panelists, Dr. Rotman, she'll be joining us later into the discussion. She has to take some permission because she has some emergency to attend to. So before we start, like I earlier mentioned, I'm co-moderating with Cynthia Isha. Cynthia Isha, do you want to give a brief introduction about yourself before I start with the questions, please?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Issa. I'm a water quality planner with the Mid-America Regional Council. And as Ngozi said, I'll be co-moderating this discussion.
Thank you, Cynthia. So I'm going to start off by asking Tom, what is stormwater runoff, and what are the common sources of stormwater runoff pollution? And when this stormwater runoff becomes polluted, where does this water like eventually end up? Tom, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. It's a great question and a terrific way to start this conversation. If we weren't living in a city and rain fell from the sky, we might just call it rainwater. In more developed spaces, as precipitation hits the surface and runs off, finding its way to a receiving water body, a lake, a stream, a river, we'd call that stormwater. And as we build and manage cities, right, we build lots of impervious surfaces that generate more stormwater runoff. So it's our challenge to figure out how to manage it to reduce flood risks, protect public safety, protect water quality, and to really protect broader sets of ecosystem services that create quality of life for our communities. So you asked about what kinds of pollutants we might find in stormwater. It could be anything that water encounters along its path once it hits the ground, right? So if it flows across a front lawn in a suburban area, it might pick up excess fertilizer that was applied, so nitrogen and phosphorus and the like. If there might be different kinds of pollutants, greases or oils or those sorts of things. It might pick up trash, litter. It might again pick up different kinds of bacteria along the way, say from pet waste. So there's lots of different sorts of pollutants, and as stormwater finds its way to rivers and streams and lakes, then all of these pollutants will enter those areas and have impacts on the aquatic health of those areas and potentially on public health as well. Most famous example, of course, would be the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a product of a lot of heavy nitrogen loading into the Gulf that comes from farm fields and front lawns, eutrophying the Gulf and depleting oxygen and killing fish stock in that area.
Thank you, Tom. Joe, do you want to add anything to what Thomas said?
No, I'd echo what Tom said, and also say that sometimes there are inappropriate illegal tie-ins with some of the stormwater from septic systems. So that's not really related to the runoff and stormwater, but that can attribute to it. And in older cities, sometimes we have combined sewer overflows where in the older parts of the city, the sanitary and the stormwater were at one time the same before we had treatment processes. And sometimes they do have a surges. So they're looking at eliminating all of those, but that's at great expense. So sometimes that is mixed in with it. Again, sometimes not intentionally or not explicitly, but sometimes there are combined sewers that contribute to that downstream through extreme stormwater events. And if we can mitigate those before they get into the stormwater or the combined sewer overflows, that can help mitigate them at much cheaper cost than some of the deep tunnel systems where they just look at storing and treating all of that combined wastewater, which is at great expense. And once you've invested in that infrastructure, you're pretty much invested forever.
Thank you, Joe. So, Joe, this question also goes to you. What do you think is the relationship between climate change and stormwater runoff?
Well, it definitely seems like we're seeing a change in precipitation distribution. We're seeing a little bit more extreme events, and it's difficult to say also because we talk about the 100-year or the 500-year flood, and in many of these cases, we don't have good enough records to statistically say what that flood would be. So it's not explicitly just climate change. It's also that we don't have a thorough understanding of what our storms are and what the intensity and duration of some of those storms can be. So when we project out, again, we just don't have the statistical record of 1,000 years of good weather data would be needed to predict out something on the order of 100 or 500-year flood with any confidence. But in the recorded record, we are seeing more intense events in the Midwest and in many areas. So, and it's not just quote unquote more rain in one area. Some places it's less. Some places it's more intense rainfalls than less frequent. So there's really no one answer to say, yes, we do see this outcome of climate change, but we certainly are seeing, again, within our recorded history, a change in those precipitation events. And around our area, they are becoming more frequent and more intense. We've had the two biggest floods in the history of Missouri and the upper Midwest in the past 10, 12 years or so. And that's, fairly obvious. And the 2019 floods were the longest duration that we had seen in recorded history. And that's really what led to a lot of issues there, not just in stormwater runoff from cities, but in our hydrologic system overall. We saw the Missouri really get tested and what we see in the Midwest. And now we're trying to deal with that. And it will be at great expense without question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Gosi, I might add a couple things to that. It's been really interesting thinking about these sets of issues. We, thinking about the way that we deal with stormwater, we tend to use an empirical approach. We look backwards at what the historical record shows and use that to project potential risks and vulnerabilities in the future. This idea that non-stationarity is no longer a given, right? That the future is going to be different from the past because of climate change means that the historical record might not be a good indicator of what we're going to look at in the future. And so there's this really interesting set of discussions about how do we blend climate modeling with the empirical approach that we've always used in stormwater management. The downscale climate models that we've generated for Kansas City would suggest we're going to see more flooding. As Joel said, right, we can expect to see more extreme events. We'll also see more drought, and we're also likely to see more extreme heat. And so trying to figure out how we blend our understanding of what climate change might bring us from future-oriented climate models with the empirical approach that we've used for stormwater management more conventionally is really tough challenge to figure out how to blend these two things together. We, like Joel, to add to the examples that Joel gave, just a couple of years ago, we had back-to-back 500-year events in Kansas City on Indian Creek, right? We're seeing extreme events, we're seeing more intense events, and it'll be interesting to think about how that might guide any changes in the way we think about managing stormwater.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Joel. So we've heard a little bit about the impact that stormwater runoff and stormwater runoff pollution can have on aquatic ecosystems. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of water quality to human health? Tom, why don't you get this one started?
Okay. Well, there's an incredibly strong linkage between environmental health and public health, and using water quality as a subset of environmental health. There's all kinds of different issues. So starting with kind of the climate variables that I just mentioned with extreme heat, right? That there's lots of public health risks associated with that. We've seen heat waves in different places that have led to substantial mortality. The way we manage stormwater can effectively cool our cities, right? And attenuate those kinds of risks. The E. coli loading from combined sewers in older cities poses very, very significant health risks. There certainly are public safety risks associated with flooding. So those are a few different things. Sometimes I like to think also about how we manage stormwater in the context of how we plan for and design and operate cities, right? So if we think about resilient, kind of walkable, communities that are sucking water into the ground, right? These places might be cooler, walkable streets might be tree lined, which help reduce flood flows. And as folks are walking more, right, there's just clear public health benefits from more active transportation styles, right? Because we know that obesity and other health issues are more and more pronounced, and we can effectively design cities and manage stormwater within those more sustainable designs to explicitly address known public health issues.
Thanks, Tom. I see that our third panelist has also joined us. Welcome, Robin. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself and some of your interests or related to stormwater runoff?
Sure thing. Well, I'm Robin Rotman, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Missouri in Columbia in the School of Natural Resources. And I'm an attorney by training with a focus on water resources and water quality. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. I apologize that I had a slight conflict at the beginning, but I'm looking forward to jumping into the discussion with my colleagues.
Absolutely. And so we're talking on the topic of impacts right now. So why don't you speak a little bit to water quality impacts on human health from your experience?
Yeah, well, an area that's of great interest to me is the relationship between ambient water quality and drinking water quality. Forgive me for just launching into the legal here, but if we think back to the early 1970s when the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act were passed, these acts were based on a premise that surface water and groundwater were disconnected resources and that ambient water quality did not have a major impact on drinking water quality. And now 50 years later, we just know that those things are not true. And so I think it's important to help catch up the regulatory regime to reflect the current scientific understanding, and to have a stronger linkage between water pollution permitting under the Clean Water Act and water intake provisions under the Safe Drinking Water Act.
That's great. Thanks, Robin. And Joel, do you want to speak a little bit to water quality impacts on human health as well? Oh, you're muted.
And I said I wasn't going to do that. I fell into the trap one more time. I echo everything that's been said. And one other aspect that we're seeing a lot more is harmful algal blooms. And when Tom was talking about, eutrophication and seeing algae take off in places, there are certain types of algae that in their just natural growth give off algal toxins. So they're compounds that essentially make us sick. And some of those toxins can actually get all the way through a drinking water treatment plant pretty readily. And we saw an outbreak of this pretty substantially in Erie, on Lake Erie in northern Ohio a few years back, where there's an algal bloom, and it was very much related to runoff of nutrients and excess loading to the Lake Erie, which is primed for having algal blooms as well. It's like a perfect storm of bad situation of a lot of urban runoff, a lot of agricultural runoff, and a very shallow, big body of water to promote that. And the algal toxins made it through the drinking water plant and really made a lot of people in the region quite ill for some time. So we're actually looking, not myself personally, but a number of our researchers on campus at how to rapidly detect that so you can alert the population, but then also deal with it in a drinking water plant, which is designed to take out pollutants, but not those types of pollutants at this time. So we're looking at new oxidants and new ways to destroy those algal toxins there. So again, and that just goes on top of it. That's just another set of potential impacts we see to society and public health from urban runoff. And again, we can't separate urban and rural runoff in a lot of these cases when it gets downstream, when we see the greater impacts that we're talking about.
So to that point, Joel, are the impacts of stormwater runoff different in urban and rural regions in Missouri?
Oh yeah, we definitely see that. And one thing that, as we were talking about earlier with the change in climate, we're also changing our urban settings quite a bit as we see more urban sprawl and more impervious surfaces, which is a term we should all become aware with if we're talking about stormwater runoff. The more parking lots, sidewalks, building roofs that we put into an urban setting, all that rainfall, as Tom was talking about, if it was out in nature, a lot of it would infiltrate or be used as evapotranspiration. But as we have more and more sprawl reaching out further, we're designing our infrastructure to shove that water downstream as fast as possible. Because me as a property owner, and I look out at our campus here, I want to get that water off the parking lot and downstream so it's not impacting my property or my people, but then that's going to impact people downstream. And one of the terms we use quite a bit is the hydrologic system flashier. Do we see things like a flash flood? And it's more responsive to a rainfall downstream where we see a really steep hydrograph with all the water coming at once. Again, it's by design. This isn't an accident that we ended up with, after we got done as an afterthought. It was designed that way, but without the intention that there would be people downstream. And the further our sprawl gets, the more there is, quote unquote, downstream. And we see these extreme events essentially being a little bit more extreme, but then focused by our urban infrastructure to having even a greater impact downstream. And again, as we have more and more sprawl, we just extend that catchment basin and the impacted hydrologic system further and further out. So where that water then reaches the natural water body, we're seeing bigger impacts all the time. Hope I answered your question there. I think I got off on a rattle and it just kept going.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joel. Tom, Robert, do you want to add anything to this discussion of the impacts of the difference in impacts between urban and rural stormwater runoff in Missouri?
I'd be happy to speak a little bit to the cost implications for utility ratepayers. So right, the sources of non-point source pollution or stormwater runoff are different. So in more rural areas, these tend to be agricultural operations, whether that's row cropping or animal agriculture, whereas Joel described the many different sources with impervious surfaces in the urban environment. I think what's interesting though on the impacts is that the impacts are not necessarily felt in the same location where the runoff originates. And you mentioned Missouri, of course, but I would call attention to a recent legal case from Iowa involving the city of Des Moines, where there was such a high concentration of nitrates in the source water for its public water supply. And those were nitrates coming from fertilizers from agricultural production, that the city had to invest a very significant amount of money to put an advanced drinking water treatment plant. So as Joel said, the run-of-the-mill drinking water treatment plant can't, or wastewater treatment plant was not designed to address nitrates or other contributors to harmful algal blooms. And so then the situation was that the utility bills for residents in the city of Des Moines went way up in order to cover the costs of that new drinking water treatment plant. And so that raises the question of whether, I think when we see significant industrial pollution of waterways under the Clean Water Act, we can require industries to do some pre-treatment on their property before releasing the pollution, say, to the public sewer. And that kind of reflects that the public sewer is meant to take in routine waste and not these special industrial wastes. And a question of whether maybe something similar could also be discussed within the agricultural community of having some of that pollution remediated before it even leaves the property, so that it has less of an impact, a health impact or a utility rate impact on residents that are downstream.
Thank you, Robin. Before we move to solutions, there's a question on impact in the chat box, and anybody is free to jump in. And Joe Holt is asking, do impervious surfaces have an effect on Missouri's aquifers? The person says it seems that the aquifer levels might be falling due to increased runoff.
I'm happy to speak to that, but I'm probably not the most qualified. Tom, would you want to have a go at it?
Go for it, and I'll go after you.
Well, I would say yes. So there is a relationship between impervious surfaces and aquifer recharge. So when there is a higher percentage of porous surfaces, the water is allowed to infiltrate and recharge the aquifer in place. And some initiatives in that regard are like promoting rain gardens or bioswales in properties, which slow the runoff and allow it to sink in. But again, if you have more impervious surfaces, and as Joel said, it's a more flashy, like flash flooding kind of system, that water is being pushed downstream. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not going to ultimately recharge some other water body somewhere, right? Like the hydrologic cycle is ultimately a closed loop cycle, but it could have regional impacts as to where the water table is.
Yeah. And I'd say definitely I'd expect some local impacts, but when you say aquifer, a lot of times you may be talking about like a regional aquifer, and on that scale, we probably haven't paved over enough on a regional basis or a state basis. But certainly if you look like just below, St. Louis or Kansas City, you'd probably see an impact.
One of the things, this isn't necessarily specific to aquifers, but just thinking about groundwater recharge, we, with more impervious surfaces, right, as the question kind of implies, right, we're not soaking it into the ground, we're pushing it straight into our creeks and streams and lakes. And so one of the remarkable statistics in Kansas City is Indian Creek. Its base flow is almost fully attributable to releases from the wastewater treatment plant. That's to say, in that watershed, there's incredibly little groundwater recharge from stormwater, right, or rainwater.
Thank you. Before we move, there's another question. I think this question came up when Joel was talking about flooding, and Leslie Brooks she's asking, would addressing stormwater issues help reduce this risk? Did you get the question?
Yeah, could you repeat it? It broke up just a little bit for me.
Oh, okay, sorry. Leslie Brooks is asking, like, would addressing stormwater issues help to reduce the risk of flooding?
Well, I'll leave it to the engineers to parse the details, but I think at a conceptual level, anytime you have a system that's more flashy, there's a higher risk of flooding because just stuff is happening faster. And so when there is an intense precipitation event, that's going to result in a rise in water in a way that would not be seen in a less flashy system. Now, I'm not sure exactly, I'm not familiar with this case study from New York City or whatever the location was. I think we also have to remember that there can be different sources of floodwaters. So whether that be coming from groundwater, whether that be coming from surface water, or in fact, like a backup of some kind of infrastructure, all of those can result in flooding of residences. So without more details, I can't prescribe an exact solution, but I think it's a general matter. Sure, better stormwater management reduces flood risks on a broad scale.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, and I'd say there definitely are things we can do in our urban setting to mitigate some of that. And St. Louis was a good example. They had it was going to be about a $4 billion effort to take all of their combined sewer overflows and put those into deep tunnel systems that have been done in Indianapolis and Chicago and other areas. And they invested quite a bit into trying to mitigate some of that through green infrastructure, regreening some areas by essentially razzing some abandoned facilities and getting more infiltration beds, more stormwater retention basins where it's going to be held back some, but also infiltrate more. And they've seen an impact from that investment, which again, not only is it the original investment, but the less you invest in the gray infrastructure of concrete and treatment, the less you're going to pay over the long haul. Because once you've invested, you're invested to maintain that, forever. Versus the green infrastructure systems, the original investment also has a return on value to the community by greening the surroundings. And as mentioned earlier, it helps actually cool the setting as well by reconnecting the watershed where you have evapotranspirative cooling in the community as well.
Thank you, Joe. So going to the solutions now to stormwater runoff pollution. So this question goes to Tom. How is stormwater pollution typically managed? Is there an overlap in the management of stormwater runoff and wastewater management?
All right, so the conventional approach, going back a generation or two, is we'd collect water when it fell from the sky and put it in a pipe and get rid of it off of our site as quickly as possible and shunt it on down to a receiving water body. And I think over the last generation, there's been growing recognition that we can probably do better than that. The conventional approach is one that really did a good job of reducing localized flooding, but it typically pushed the problem downstream and at the same time didn't do anything to protect the ecology of our waterways or to address water quality kinds of issues. And so, over the last generation, nationally and internationally, there's a world of stormwater best management practices that have been explored and refined. And from a city planning perspective, we're trying to put the water in the ground, soak it up into the ground before it ever reaches any kind of hard infrastructure, and reestablish natural hydrology to the extent that we're able to do so. And so a lot of these best practices are wrapped around that idea. Others of these practices might be explicitly focused on protecting water quality in addition to dealing with flood risks, oftentimes just trying to do those two things at the same time. And so there's a variety of different kinds of strategies that might come into play. I see Dan Barry's question about the Washington, D.C. example. It requires on-site capture of the first flush of rain. Here in Kansas City, we might think about the first 1.37, 1.4 inches of rain, which would roughly equate to our 2-year storm. And I think there's recognition that we can probably infiltrate and retain, if not the full 1.4 inches, a good portion of that through the use of best management practices and native landscaping and urban forestry and bioretention and those kinds of things. Washington, D.C. then took it to the next level. And so if in a highly dense urban environment like that, of course, not everybody could do that. Oftentimes they do it either with cisterns or with green roofs. But if they weren't able to do it, then if somebody had overbuilt on their site, then they could sell credits to other property owners who weren't able to do that. We haven't got a system that refined here in Kansas City, but I think we're increasingly trying to figure out how do we retain that first flush on site in service of multiple community goals around water quality and flood risk reduction, and then thinking even more broadly around climate resilience. There was a second part of that question about overlaps with wastewater management. And the first thought that occurs to me there would be in our combined sewer areas. So in Kansas City, that would be in portions of Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri, where the same conduits serve both stormwater and wastewater. And when it rains too much, right, that results in combined sewer overflows into our streams and rivers. And of course, we don't want that. And so there's all kinds of different strategies that those two cities and others who have combined sewer systems are exploring. And those strategies include green infrastructure strategies and a variety of other structural engineering solutions to try and remediate those problems.
Thank you, Tom. Does any other panelists want to add to that question? If though, I can move to the next one. So the next question is, what are some of the evidence-based practices for stormwater management in Missouri, and what federal, state, and local policies support the deployment of these best practices? And a follow-up question to that is, what is the role of engineers in the design and implementation of these best practices? I think, Joel, you might be I'm in the best position to answer that.
Sure, I'll jump in. And what we've looked at the most is green roof technology, but it's also very similar to permeable pavers or rain gardens, infiltration beds. Of implementing that in the urban setting does dissipate some of the rainfall runoff. And as Tom was kind of pointing out, trying to get rid of 1.4 inches, I think you said, It's pretty difficult to get rid of that in a short period, and some of that would run off anyway. But like we've quantified that, and we can take care of about 60%, like I said, of the rainfall over a 1-year study that was held on the green roof and evapotranspired back up. And the engineer's part is to understand that and project that out and talk about what the value and the benefit of that is, and how much of our infrastructure, our urban setting would we need to convert to something that's going to mitigate some of that stormwater runoff and the flashiness that we've talked about. So we can project that out. But then you talked about how the implementation happens. And that's where it gets a little bit more difficult for an engineer or for anyone really to have that impact. Because if I put a green roof on my building, it costs me money and I dissipate some of the stormwater, but that's the stormwater that would have gone downstream, not what comes to me. So I don't see the benefit of my investment other than, I'm doing the right thing. I might get LEED certification points. So some of that incentivizes those practices and that implementation, but we need to understand, the community economic vehicles that are available to foster this responsiveness, such as incentives or tax rebates. The one comment was talking about in Washington, D.C., they need to dissipate some of it, and some places have taxes on impervious surfaces. The more impervious surfaces you have, the more you pay in taxes, because somebody downstream has to deal with the consequences of your impervious surface. So if you alter that and put in permeable pavers or a green roof or an infiltration bed, then you get some of those taxes back to help incentivize that behavior or pay for it. So in summary there, yes, we have technologies that can be helpful. Sometimes they have benefit to those making the investment, but a lot of times we need to look at what is our social valuation of these things across, a region or across a city, to say, yes, we're going to help people invest in this because it's a community benefit. It's not the individual's benefit. Hope I didn't go too far there.
Well, this question is a terrific one. So I had intimated that there's a generation or more of history in using different sorts of stormwater best management practices. And there's a lot of people who are collecting data about the performance of these sorts of practices under different conditions. And so there's a lot of evidence that suggests, to what degree these different kinds of engineering design practices or planning practices might work. And so I think the next step really is for us to be able to put these things within a watershed context, right? So we're not just looking at what's happening on a particular development site, but trying to understand how we can focus our investments to achieve the broadest public benefit, as Joel was describing, through investments and practices and designs that provide, the different kinds of benefits that we might seek. The question about local policies and the deployment of these practices is something that's front of mind for us in Kansas City. Back about almost 20 years ago, we revised our regional policies for how we manage stormwater in the metro area. And there's now discussion about taking another look at that, because in the intervening 20 years or so, there's a lot that's changed. For one, we have a much clearer understanding about climate change. Even if they have imperfect understanding, we understand that those impacts are real and that we need to adjust for them. But there's also been changes in technology and in data and in modeling and in understanding about the design of these different things. And so we're talking about rewriting our regional standards for how we deal with stormwater from an engineering perspective, and then in turn linking that to the planning practice, right? So the engineering design is one side of this, but linking it to broader land use and comprehensive planning creates all kinds of opportunities to think about, how we're planning for our communities, how stormwater relates to our park systems, how it can be built to improve public health or address social equity kinds of issues, and improve sort of the ecology of the community all at the same time. So it's a big challenge in front of us. We're trying to figure out really the best way about going about that, so we can do better, in the next decade than we have over the last one.
Thanks, Tom. So you started talking there about a couple of different green infrastructure components, and I just thought we could spend a little bit of time talking about how green infrastructure can be utilized to mitigate stormwater pollution in Missouri. Tom, why don't you start on this one since you're already kind of following that train of thought?
Will you ask one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So how can green infrastructure be utilized to mitigate stormwater pollution in Missouri?
So by green infrastructure in the stormwater engineering community, oftentimes it's used to think about, an infiltration bed, a porous pavement, a bioretention cell, a detention pond, a retention pond, those kinds of things. In the parks and sort of ecological community, you might think more broadly about whole watersheds or riparian corridors, stream corridors, or connected natural areas. And so we can take these two sets of ideas together and think about how can we design our communities to maximize sustainability and resilience co-benefits along with the key or core objectives that we've traditionally focused on in stormwater realm, which are really about flooding and water quality. So green infrastructure, if you plant a tree, it can help the soil absorb more water and more water will evapotranspire, as Joel has noted. But at the same time, we're creating habitat, we're creating beauty, we're enhancing real estate values. We got a place to hang our hammocks. There's just one win piled on top of the next, and so we can extrapolate from a single tree to a forest, or thinking about a prairie or a wetland, and these different complexes that exist in our natural environment, and think about how we can steward them in ways that create real value for our communities and deal with our flood risks and water quality and other issues. So the green infrastructure framework is one that just creates a ton of opportunity to think differently about city planning and engineering design for stormwater.
Joel, Robin, do you want to add anything to this conversation about green infrastructure's ability to mitigate stormwater pollution?
I think I mentioned a little bit about the quantity, but as far as the pollution goes, one of the interesting things is we looked at different green roof medias, and if you're going to grow plants in some of these kind of filters, you actually have to add nutrients. So we saw a degradation of water quality from implementing the green roof, but we also understood how to mitigate some of that by essentially washing the media or the types of nutrients you use in it that support the plant growth, but are not labile enough to wash through quickly. We reduced that considerably. So it was a short-term impact on the water quality downstream, but a long-term impact on the water quantity. So I think we need to be kind of cognizant of, if we're trying to implement one solution for one problem, that it doesn't maybe exacerbate another one. And that's a great example of our current infrastructure. We were dealing with flooding of our buildings and our areas of living through designing stormwater drainage systems to get rid of the water fast. The unintended consequence was the downstream we saw flashier systems and more erosion and degradation of urban streams. But otherwise, yes, there are definitely ways to treat some of those pollutants. And Tom was talking about E. coli and some of the microbial impacts to stormwater. If we have riparian filtration systems, that can really be effective in that. And one thing that we've really removed from a lot of our urban settings, and for good reason, again, but with unintended consequences, was anything that's a wetland. We've really got rid of a lot of standing water. If it's not flowing water or a nice type of a pond or a lake, we've really gotten rid of that to get rid of vectors such as mosquitoes or other pests. But again, at a cost that actually is a very good filter for a lot of our water quality before it reaches streams and water bodies downstream.
I could jump in with a more general commentary on the legal and policy systems in which these types of solutions could be deployed. So going back to the Clean Water Act, which governs discharges into ambient waters, the Clean Water Act has been much more successful at controlling pollution from point sources through the NPDES permitting program. And this has really generated significant improvement in water quality in the US over the past 50 years. And so those NPDES permits apply in the context of like a combined sewer overflow or separate sewer overflows, where kind of the carrot and the stick approach is that there can be penalties imposed for violating permits. Now, I think that the EPA and the MDNR and other agencies have recognized that both St. Louis and Kansas City have some areas of quite dated infrastructure, and it's a process through which this infrastructure is modernized, both the gray infrastructure, the built environment, like building tunnels for water capture, as well as through greener solutions. And so instead of imposing penalty after penalty, the EPA and these cities in Missouri and across the country have entered consent decrees where over a period of 20 or 25 years, different improvements have to be made. On the non-point source side of things, the Clean Water Act doesn't currently have the same sort of teeth or enforcement capabilities. So there is certainly consideration of non-point source pollution. This is a leading topic of Section 319 of the Clean Water Act. This is part of the total maximum daily load, the TMDL process. But by and large, the Clean Water Act still allows states great discretion as to what they intend to do with regards to non-point source pollution, whether that be from agricultural or rural sources or from urban sources or impervious surfaces. And so as I listen to my colleagues talk about all of these engineering solutions that now exist or that are under development, the question is, well, how to get those implemented on the ground. And certainly an incentive fund is always a popular mechanism, right? The question is, so where is the money coming from in order to provide those financial incentives? And I would take the position that currently under the federal statutory framework, a lot of these good efforts that Tom and Joel described are basically being done by cities or regional authorities kind of out of the goodness of their heart because they believe it to be the right thing to do and not because there's a strong federal enforcement threat that's shaping their behavior.
So Robert, I'm going to come back to you with the question from our chat. Is there a clearinghouse or other source of policy samples for updating land development codes or other planning documents at the city or county level? Current engineering standards do not account for new extreme weather events.
I'm not aware of one. I guess I'm speaking more broadly to the federal context. I don't know if my colleagues are familiar with model, for example, like model zoning codes. Perhaps there's something under the National Flood Insurance Program that's offered as a template documentation to cities, but I'm not specifically aware of it.
Linda, thank you for your question. So going back to Joel's comment about impervious areas, right? So our goal would be to reduce the total amount of impervious areas and then to disconnect those impervious areas. And so there's all kinds of provisions in local planning and zoning regulations that speak to street width, setback requirements, parking maximums, parking minimums, right? These and all of these things affect the amount and distribution of impervious areas. And so you kind of have to look at all the planning and zoning regulations to see where there are opportunities to adjust those to reduce stormwater runoff and also deal with other issues like traffic safety or walkability or resilience and the like. I see that you asked a follow-up question about protecting green infrastructure. And so it was interesting, just this past year, we developed a couple of model ordinances, one on tree protection and another to facilitate native landscaping. We know from the green infrastructure perspective that it's much easier to protect something existing than to replant or restore, right? And so if we can create opportunities to protect existing resources, again, an individual tree or a forest or a wetland or a floodplain our prairie, then there's real value there. And so there's all kinds of planning dimensions to that. There could be planning and zoning regulations that speak to site design on individual projects. But there's a lot of opportunities for communities to protect existing natural resources in the face of development.
Thank you, Tom. Robin, there's a question in the chat from Leslie Brooks. She's asking, speaking of real estate values, do you think it's necessary to begin a cultural change on what a well-manicured lawn looks like and what is acceptable? She said, I know many homeowners associations fine homeowners for even a few weeds growing in their yard. And for that and other reasons, it's quite common for fertilizers and pesticides to be used at the household level, contributing to these negative consequences of runoff. And if so, how do we go about this?
I love this question so much. Thank you, Leslie. And this whole question of the role of homeowners associations, I think is going to be my next law review article. So homeowners associations, right, are non-governmental, but the homeowners that are subject to the homeowners association and its various covenants that the homeowners association impose are legally bound to comply with those standards. And so this could be everything. Many of these do have environmental implications, be it lawn care, could be a prohibition on drying clothes on a clothesline. It could be a prohibition from leaving a junky car in your driveway or whatever. And so the question here is about the power that HOAs have. That power derives from state law. And so there are now some initiatives, both in Missouri and in other states, for state legislation that would prohibit homeowners associations from imposing certain covenants that discourage environmentally responsible behavior. Specifically, there's some homeowners associations that will prohibit installation of solar panels, and now a pending bill that would prohibit homeowners associations from prohibiting the installation of solar panels. So I think that there could be a legal solution at the state level to rein in the power of the HOAs. Now, do I think there should be a cultural change? Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what to tell you in order to motivate that change, but I think that giving people this freedom to maintain their yard in the way that they wish is a good place to start.
I might add a little bit to that discussion. I know that Cynthia, whose job is to moderate this discussion, not to opine, runs a regional water quality education program in Kansas City that talks all about healthy lawns and trying to focus on things like lawn management practices that might contribute to water quality impairment, and do so in different ways, including facilitating native landscaping and those kinds of things. I'd again mention on our website, I think a link was provided to the Green Infrastructure Framework on Mark's website. If you scroll down, there's a link to a model ordinance for native landscaping. I know that in many cases, communities might restrict grasses growing from more than 8 inches tall or 10 inches tall. And so what happens if you're growing a sunflower, it might be 8 feet tall, right? How do native landscapes might be effectively outlawed by existing weed ordinances because those plants grow taller, but yet we know there's all kinds of reasons and benefits from growing those things. And so adopting an ordinance like that might be one step that could be coupled with community education programs to try and legitimize the use or help folks appreciate the value of different kinds of practices and aesthetics.
I would just call attention, Michael, who I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but posted a very insightful comment in the chat that I may have been in response to something I said, which is that the vast majority of the time resolution of these issues does not require a litigation approach. Yeah, like if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but he has discussed his extensive experience working with homeowners and developers and HOAs to bring their infrastructure into compliance. So I'm glad he contributed that note.
Thank you. So before we wrap up in the last 5 minutes, I just want to call to our attention that some links are being added to the chat for additional resources. One of our LCN community, one of our LCN editorial board member, Galen Dodds, he wrote a science note on stormwater runoff in Missouri. So please try and look it out and read up. And also some of our fellows wrote the science note on flood resilience. So please to also look up this science notes. In addition to this, there is a link that is being put up right now for you to help evaluate the quality of the roundtable event. Please, we love your feedback. It helps us improve the quality of the roundtable event. And yes, and then we shared some additional resources from our panelists that you can always go to and read more about stormwater runoff. So to bring this to a close, so in the last 5 minutes, just your final thought. What are your key takeaways for scientists or science advocates to share with their local officials? Probably I'll start with Joel. You're muted.
Oh, what was? Pardon me. What was that? I couldn't.
Your final thoughts, your key takeaways, on stormwater runoff for scientists and science advocates to share with their local officials.
Yeah, I think share awareness. We talked about a lot of vehicles and everything from HOAs to regulatory to vehicles, but I think it starts with education. If people understand a little bit more individually, then they can combine together as a society or a formal government when we talk about HOAs and say something that we want to have a community that's better, more resilient in these cases. But it really starts with understanding why, and to say that we are in this together as a society and a community to try and tackle these problems, because we do have the solutions out there for a lot of these approaches. We just don't have the social awareness to do it and the social and political willpower to see it through. There's so many things that we could be doing better for our communities, and we just choose not to out of ignorance or, again, out of a lack of willpower as a society or as a community to do it. So, and I want to say thank you all for your attention, and it's people on the call that are making differences that we talk about, and we need to get more people out there. So try to pay it forward. Whatever you picked up today, try to pass it along to 10 more people and see the change that we hope to see in our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Robin, you can go next.
Sure. Well, it's been such a pleasure participating today. I know I have so many ideas coming out of this meeting. And perhaps similar to Joel, my main takeaway is just excitement at seeing that this issue is receiving increased attention. I think non-point source pollution is sort of the forgotten kind of pollution because we don't see it in the same way that we see other forms of pollution. And it's not top of mind for many members of the general public. So I'm glad that this program is raising awareness about it. And I would just say, coming from the State University, from Mizzou, it's our hope that our research on these issues can be relevant to the public in Missouri, and that we can identify issues and potential solutions that are actually have the potential to be useful on the ground. So I would certainly welcome any follow-up communications or any feedback on our remarks today.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, I'd echo Joel and Robin's comments. It's been a pleasure, and Ngozi, I appreciate your and your whole team's work to organize this event. I think my single biggest takeaway is that we know how to do this, and we can think about water as a real asset to our communities, and we can manage it in ways through a stewardship mindset that really can do a whole lot of things for us. It can improve public health, it can improve the environment, it can reduce public safety risks, and make our communities more resilient well into the future. So it's a little bit different frame from how we've done it in the past, but I think we know how, and the opportunity in front of us is creative and fun and exciting, and we got to figure out how to get there.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. So a very big thank you to everyone for tuning into our roundtable event. Next month, May, we're going to be discussing tick-borne diseases. So please spread the word, join us next month. And I want to say a very big thank you to the panelists for taking out time from their busy schedules to come and increase the awareness of stormwater runoff to our participants. And for the participants who joined, we can't have a roundtable without you. We are also very happy to have you all on this call. And I hope to see everyone in the next roundtable event. And a very big shout out to Cynthia for co-moderating with me. Thanks a lot. All right, now I'll say bye. Do enjoy the rest of your day and your week. Bye, everyone. Bye.